She walked into that room carrying nothing but a handmade bag, and every woman in Red Hollow Valley laughed at her. What they didn't know was that bag would one day save all of their lives. The widows came with gold. They came with silk and silver and the kind of beauty that costs money to maintain. They came with land deeds folded into their purses and smiles practiced in front of mirrors. And when Nora Whitfield walked through that door holding a leather saddlebag she'd stitched with her own two hands, the laughter hit her like a wall. But one man didn't laugh. One man went quiet. And that silence, that single, still moment, was the beginning of everything. If you want to know how a woman with nothing became the most respected person in an entire valley, stay until the end. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The thing about Red Hollow Valley was that it had a long memory and a short mercy. It was the kind of place where a woman's worth got measured by the width of her land holdings and the weight of her jewelry, where a man's reputation could be built in a season and a woman's could be destroyed in an afternoon. The valley sat between two long ridges of Montana rock that turned purple at dusk, and in the summer of 1883, it held maybe 400 souls, a handful of working ranches, and more ambition than the land could reasonably support. Caleb Mercer's ranch, the Double Horn, sat at the northern end of the valley, 312 acres of good grassland that he'd built from 140 over the course of 11 years. He'd bought his first parcel at 22 with money he'd saved working other men's cattle drives, and he'd added to it slowly, carefully, the way a man does when he knows how fast things can go wrong. He was 33 now, not especially tall, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they'd been carved from the same red rock as the valley walls. He had a reputation for being fair, for paying decent wages, for not cheating the men who worked his land even when it would have been easy to. He'd been a widower for 2 years, his wife Clara having died of a fever that swept through the valley in the winter of 1881, and in the year following her death, he'd kept entirely to himself. That period of keeping to himself was what made the spring of 1883 so interesting to the women of Red Hollow Valley. Margaret Hollis heard it first, or she claimed to. She told Dorothy Crane at the dry goods counter that Caleb Mercer had been seen at the social in Billings, that he danced twice with a woman from Helena, and that his foreman, a reliable man named Pete Walsh, had mentioned to someone that Caleb was thinking about putting the main house back in order. Dorothy told Edna Pratt. Edna told her sister. Within 2 weeks, the information had traveled through every parlor and kitchen in the valley, and by the time it reached the widows, the 4 or 5 women of property and standing who'd been widowed by ranching accidents and hard winters, it had transformed into something close to an announcement. Margaret Hollis was the most formidable of them. She was 41, handsome in a sharp-featured way, and she owned 160 acres adjoining the Double Horn's eastern fence line. Her husband Roy had died 3 years back from a horse kick to the chest, and she had managed the Hollis place with a competence that surprised people who hadn't known her well. She wore her jewelry during the day, which in Red Hollow Valley was a signal of something. She also had 2 daughters by Roy, both grown and married off, which meant she had no encumbrances, as she put it. Dorothy Crane was 52 and owned a small cattle operation with the help of a hired man. She was softer than Margaret, but no less ambitious, and she had the particular skill of making everything she wanted sound like something she was doing for someone else. There were others. Bess McAllister, recently widowed and still unsure what she wanted. Caroline Voss, who'd inherited her husband's silver mine shares and wore them figuratively at all times, and together they formed the informal social center of the valley's respectable class. None of them would have included Nora Whitfield in that circle. But Nora had come to Red Hollow Valley 4 years earlier with a trunk of tools and a letter of introduction from a seamstress in Bozeman. She was 26 when she arrived, and she set up a small workroom in the back of a building on the town's main street that also housed a boot repair shop and for a while a dentist who came through every few months. She was not from ranching people. Her father had been a saddler in Ohio, her mother a dressmaker, and she had learned both trades before she was 15. When her parents died within a year of each other, she'd headed west with the practicality of someone who understands that grief is a luxury and rent is not. She was big. That was the first thing people noticed, and in Red Hollow Valley, people did not always find subtle ways to communicate their observations. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with thick arms that came from years of working heavy leather, and she had a wide face and dark hair she wore pinned up in a way that was functional rather than fashionable. She was not the kind of woman that the Valley's social imagination made room for, and she understood this without being particularly wounded by it. She had work. She had enough to eat. She had a small room above the workroom that she kept clean and to herself. What Nora had that most people didn't notice was hands that could do almost anything. She could cut and stitch leather with a precision that made the boot repair man 2 walls over genuinely envious. She could take a bolt of rough fabric and turn it into something a woman could wear to church. She could repair a bridle that any sensible person would have thrown away. She kept her prices fair and her mouth mostly shut, and over 4 years she had built a small, steady clientele among the ranching families who valued work over appearance. She'd met Caleb Mercer twice, once when he'd brought in a bridle for repair, and once when his foreman Pete had come in with a commission for a pair of leather work gloves, custom-sized. Caleb had come to collect the gloves himself. He'd looked at them carefully, turned them over, pressed the seams with his thumb, and then looked up and said they were fine work. Not effusive, just accurate. Nora had charged him $2.50, and he'd paid without negotiating, which in her experience was the mark of someone who understood what things cost to make. She hadn't thought about him beyond that. The gathering at Margaret Hollis's house on the second Saturday of May was not officially about Caleb Mercer. It was described in the note Margaret sent around as a spring social, a chance for the Valley's better families to take some refreshment and enjoy the season. But Nora, who was not on the list of invitees, heard about it secondhand from the wife of one of Caleb's ranch hands, a woman named Ida Walsh, Pete's wife, who came in twice a year for dress alterations and who had a gift for accidentally telling people things she probably shouldn't. Margaret's invited Caleb, Ida said, sitting in the chair beside Nora's work table while Nora pinned the hem of a cotton dress. And Dorothy and Caroline and Bess, the whole collection. That's her right, Nora said, not looking up from the pins. They're all bringing gifts, Ida said. Margaret's bringing a set of silver table things, apparently. Dorothy's bringing a horse, an actual horse. Nora did look up at that. A horse. A good one, Pete says. A quarter-horse mare, already trained. Ida shook her head. It's like an auction. Nora went back to her pinning. She wasn't invited. That was fine. She had work. But later that evening, sitting alone in her room above the workroom, she found herself thinking about it. Not about Caleb exactly, or not only about him. She was thinking about the saddlebag. She'd been working on it for 6 weeks, not for any specific purpose, but because she had scraps of particularly good leather, a double-tanned cowhide she'd gotten from a rancher settling a debt, and an idea that had been sitting in her head about how to configure the internal compartments. She'd been thinking about the problem a working man actually faced, things shifting in the bag, the weight distribution wrong, the flap latch that always failed at the worst moment. She'd made 3 prototype versions before she was happy with the 4th, and the 4th was very good. The stitching was tight and even, the leather properly oiled, the latch mechanism a small innovation she was genuinely proud of, a double catch that required intentional pressure to open but could be worked with one hand, even with a glove on. She sat there in the lamplight and thought about a thing Ida had said without quite meaning to say it. Pete told me Caleb's been using that same old saddlebag since before Clara died. The stitching's going on it. Nora hadn't been invited to the social, but she knew where the double horn was. She spent 3 more days on the bag. She reinforced the bottom panel, added a smaller interior pocket with its own closure, and spent an afternoon on the decorative tooling along the flap. Not elaborate, just a clean running border and a small compass rose, the kind of thing a person might find useful to look at when they were tired and far from home. She oiled the whole thing twice, wrapped it in cloth, and on the Saturday of Margaret's gathering, she put on her better dress, tied her hair up as neatly as she could manage, and walked the 2 miles to the Hollis place. She heard the laughter before she got through the door. Not at her, not yet. Just the general sound of women who had dressed up and drunk lemonade and were feeling good about themselves. Margaret Hollis had a proper parlor with actual upholstered furniture, and the room was full of it when Nora stepped in. Margaret in the good chair nearest the fireplace, Dorothy and Bess on the settee, Caroline standing by the window in a green dress that had probably been ordered from back east. Caleb Mercer stood near the far wall with a glass in his hand, talking to Pete Walsh, who'd been brought along as company or possibly as witness to whatever was about to unfold. The room went quiet for a moment when Nora walked in. Not dramatically quiet, just a pause. The kind that happens when someone enters a space they weren't expected in. Margaret recovered first. Her face did something complicated. Surprise, calculation, and something close to amusement, before settling into a smile that had the warmth of a closed window. "Nora," she said, "we didn't think you were coming." "I wasn't invited," Nora said. She was not going to pretend otherwise. "I brought something for Mr. Mercer. I can leave it and go." She held out the cloth-wrapped bag. Caleb crossed the room. He was looking at her with a directness that wasn't unfriendly, just paying attention, the way he'd looked at the gloves. He took the package and unwrapped it, and for a moment he just looked at the saddlebag. He didn't say anything right away. He turned it over, pressed the leather, found the latch, and worked it twice. Click, click, looked at the interior pockets, examined the stitching along the bottom panel. Margaret's voice came from behind him. "Caleb, you absolutely must see what Dorothy's brought." A pause, and then, "I believe she's brought you a horse." A ripple of appreciative laughter. "It is a horse," Dorothy said, pleased. "A fine mare. Already knows the double horn range, practically." Caleb was still looking at the bag. "A saddlebag," Caroline said from the window, and there was a particular note in her voice. Light, amused, as if she were pointing out something charming and a little pathetic at the same time. How practical. That was when the laughter started. Not vicious, exactly. It was the social kind, the kind that happens when a group of people simultaneously find permission to say what they've been thinking. Bess McAllister had the grace to look uncomfortable, but she laughed too, a small reflexive sound she seemed to regret immediately. "It's very sweet," Margaret said, which was the cruelest thing she could have said because the word sweet in that context meant small and lesser, and not what we're doing here. Nora had known this might happen. She'd known it all the way here, and she'd come anyway, which was either courage or stubbornness. And she was no longer sure there was a difference. She kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. Caleb turned around. He was not laughing. His expression was, and this was the thing Nora would turn over in her mind for weeks afterward, not embarrassed on her behalf, not pitying. He was simply looking at her like someone who had made a decision. "This is your work," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said, "the latch. I modified it. Double catch. You can work it with one hand." He worked it again. Click. "Yeah." He looked up. "What's the leather?" "Double-tanned cowhide. Better water resistance. The stitching is wax thread. It'll outlast the leather." "What do you want for it?" "Nothing. It's a gift." Caleb nodded once, slowly, the way a person does when they're filing information away carefully. Then he tucked the saddlebag under his arm, picked up his glass, and turned back toward the room. "Dorothy," he said, "the mare is a generous offer, and I thank you for it. I've got good horses at the moment, but I know Tom Carver's been looking. You might find a fair deal there." He said it without embarrassment, without apology, just clean and direct, the way he did everything. The room was quiet again. A different kind of quiet. Margaret looked at Nora. Nora looked back at her. Neither of them said anything. But the walk home was long enough to be unpleasant and short enough that she couldn't pretend she'd forgotten any of it. The laughter had not been a surprise. The look on Caleb Mercer's face had been. She went back to her workroom and sat at her table in the dark for a while before she lit the lamp, because sometimes the dark is less exhausting than the light. She wasn't crying. She didn't particularly want to cry. What she was doing was the slow, practical work of understanding what had just happened, the way she assessed a piece of leather before she cut it. What was here? What could be worked with? What couldn't? She had walked into Margaret Hollis's parlor uninvited, held out a thing she'd made with her hands, and been laughed at by 4 women who had collectively decided that worth was something you displayed rather than demonstrated. She had expected that. What she had not expected was Caleb Mercer working the latch. Click, click. The particular quality of his attention, the same attention he'd given the gloves, landing on her work as though the laughter in the room were a weather event that didn't concern him. She was not going to let herself make too much of that. She lit the lamp and went back to work. He came to the workroom 4 days later. Not for a commission, as it turned out. He stood in the doorway for a moment, shocked. She was in the middle of cutting a panel and didn't look up immediately. And then he said, "I've been thinking about the bag." Nora set down the cutting knife. "I hope there's nothing wrong with it." "No." He stepped inside, took his hat off. The saddlebag was in his hand. "I've been using it. I want to understand how you came up with the latch." It was such an odd thing to lead with that she just answered it. She described the problem she'd been trying to solve, the way the original design failed under certain conditions, the 3 attempts before the 4th version worked. He listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding, and when she finished, he said, "But the weight distribution is different too. I can feel it." "Lower center," she said. "The contents stay stable when the horse moves." He nodded again. "I've been ranching since I was 16. I've never had a bag that did that." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, which was usually a reasonable choice. Caleb turned his hat in his hands. "I'd like to commission a second one," he said. "For my foreman. Different configuration, probably. Pete's got different gear." He looked at her. "I'll pay what it's worth." "I know you will," she said. "You always have." Something shifted in his face. Not a smile exactly, more like an acknowledgement. He put his hat back on. "Would you be willing to come out to the Double Horn? Pete could tell you what he needs, save me trying to describe it." "I could do that," Nora said. "Saturday morning, if that suits." Saturday morning suits. She didn't tell anyone she was going. There was no one to tell, really. No friends in the valley close enough for that kind of confidence. But even if there had been, she would have kept it to herself because she knew how it would be received, and she didn't want the weight of other people's interpretations before she'd formed her own. The Double Horn on a Saturday morning was loud with work. 3 hands were repairing fence line on the west pasture, 2 more were dealing with something in the barn that required a lot of shouting, and Pete Walsh was in the middle of a complicated argument with a delivery man about the weight of a grain shipment when Nora arrived. He held up one finger at her, just a minute, and spent another 5 minutes winning the argument in a methodical, unhurried way before turning to her with a grin. "You're the one made Caleb's bag," he said. "I am." "Good work. He showed me the latch." Pete held out his hand. "Pete Walsh. My wife Ida comes to you for her dresses." "I know. She told me you were coming to the gathering." Pete winced. "She tells people things. It's a gift. Her perspective differs from mine on whether it's a good one." He glanced toward the main house. "Caleb's finishing up with the books. Walk with me. I'll tell you what I need." They walked the property for an hour, Pete describing his requirements with the detail of a man who had thought about this particular problem for a long time. He needed more room in the main compartment, different positioning for the tool loops, reinforcement at the bottom corner that always wore first. He was specific without being demanding, and Nora found herself genuinely interested in the problem he was describing. It was a different use pattern than Caleb's, and the differences were interesting. Caleb found them near the west barn, drinking coffee that Pete had produced from some interior pocket. He looked at Nora for a moment before he looked at Pete. Then he said, "Are you giving her coffee made from the stuff I told you to throw out last month?" Pete considered this. "I'm giving her coffee," he said carefully. "I'll have the cook make a fresh pot." He looked at Nora. "If you have time." "I have time," she said. She had coffee at the Double Horn, and then she had a second cup. And somewhere in the middle of the second cup, the conversation moved from the question of Pete's saddlebag to the question of the water situation on the east pasture, which led to the question of how the drought that had been building for 2 years was going to affect the valley's smaller ranching families. Caleb spoke about this with a seriousness that she found interesting. It wasn't performative concern. He was working through an actual problem. "The Kellerman place is going to have trouble," he said. He was looking at the window, at the dry brown hills past the glass. "They've got 300 head and not enough water to see them through if July goes like June." "Tom Kellerman won't ask for help," Pete said. "He'd rather lose the cattle." "I know he would." Caleb picked up his coffee cup, looked into it, set it down. "There are 6 or 7 operations in the same position. They can't all lose their cattle." "Have you thought about the creek diversion?" Nora said. Both men looked at her. She wasn't sure why she'd said it. Or she was. She'd been thinking about it since she'd walked the property and seen the way the land lay. "There's a secondary channel," she said, "below the north ridge. It runs when there's enough water pressure from the spring melt. You could reinforce it, route it down the east side. It wouldn't solve everything, but it might distribute the water more evenly across the smaller places. Caleb was looking at her with that quality of attention again. You noticed the secondary channel. I noticed topography, she said. It's useful for drainage when I'm planning a workroom. Old habit. Pete was grinning into his coffee. Caleb pulled a piece of paper from somewhere and said, Show me. She spent 20 minutes sketching what she'd seen, and Caleb spent 20 minutes asking questions that were specific and intelligent. And by the time she left the Double Horn that afternoon, she had an order for Pete's saddlebag, a commission for 2 sets of leather water bucket handles that were less likely to fail in dry conditions, and the beginning of something she was still too careful to name. The rumors reached her before she'd been back to town 3 hours. Ida Walsh, who had, in fairness, not been present for any of it, but whose husband had been present for most of it, had apparently mentioned to someone at the dry goods store that Nora Whitfield had spent the morning at the Double Horn. By the time the information had traveled to Margaret Hollis's ear, it had acquired a particular character. Margaret came to the workroom the following Monday. She knocked, which was more courtesy than Nora had expected, and then stood in the doorway in a way that was meant to communicate that she wasn't entirely sure the space warranted her presence. I thought I should speak to you plainly, Margaret said. I'd prefer that, Nora said. She kept working. She was stitching a bridle, and she didn't set it down. Caleb Mercer is a serious man with serious standing in this valley. The women who've expressed interest in him are appropriate matches. Women of property. Women who understand what's required. Nora said nothing. I'm not saying this to be unkind. I'm saying it because I think you may have misunderstood what happened at my gathering. Caleb is a polite man. He was being polite. Nora set the bridle down, which she hadn't intended to do. He commissioned work, she said. I went to the ranch to take measurements. That's the whole of what happened. For now, Margaret said. Something in her voice had thinned. I've seen how these things go. A woman in your position starts to mistake professional courtesy for something personal, and then everyone ends up embarrassed. I'll try to keep track of what's professional and what's personal, Nora said. Thank you for the guidance. Margaret stood there another moment. Something moved across her face that might have been doubt, or might have been irritation that Nora hadn't been more visibly affected. Then she left. Nora picked up the bridle and went back to stitching. Her hands, she noticed, were perfectly steady. By the end of May, Caleb had come back to the workroom twice for reasons that were technically professional and ran longer than strictly necessary. Once for the finished commission, which he examined with the same careful attention he always gave her work, and once on a Tuesday afternoon when he brought a broken harness strap that needed a splice and then stayed for 3/4 of an hour talking about the creek diversion, which he had apparently discussed with 6 of the valley's smaller ranchers with more interest than Pete had expected. Nora was careful with herself about this. She was 29 years old, and she had not lived the kind of life that encouraged foolish hope, and she was aware in a clear-eyed way that the space between a man who respects your work and something more was considerable and full of places a person could trip. She kept her expectations flat. She did the work. She paid attention, but she also noticed things. She noticed that he asked questions and then listened to the whole answer, which was not nothing. She noticed that he never talked about Clara, but he didn't flinch away from the subject when it came up naturally, and once when she mentioned noticing a small grave marker near the north fence, he said, "She picked that spot herself," in a voice that was matter-of-fact and full of grief at the same time. She noticed that he laughed at things that were actually funny, not at things that were supposed to be, and that his laugh was not particularly musical or impressive, but that it was entirely genuine. She noticed that he'd started using the saddlebag every day. Pete Walsh told her this. Pete had apparently appointed himself an informal narrator of events at the Double Horn. "He takes it on every ride," Pete said, sitting in her workroom eating an apple because he'd come by with a strap that needed mending and arrived at lunchtime. "Showed it to the Billings harness man last week. Old Gruber said it was fine work. Caleb told him who'd made it." "He didn't need to do that," Nora said. "No," Pete agreed. "He didn't." She kept her face down over the work. Pete ate his apple. "Margaret Hollis came to see him," Pete said more carefully. "Last Thursday. She stayed for supper." "That's her right," Nora said. "It is." Pete dropped the apple core in the waste bin and stood up. Caleb was polite, and she left at a reasonable hour. He told me after that she was a capable woman who made him feel like property. Nora looked up. Pete's expression was neutral. He said it like it was an observation, not a complaint. That's just how Caleb talks. He picked up his hat. Strap ready by Friday? Wednesday, she said. Good. He put his hat on. He's going to ask if he can come with you to see the Kellerman place, the creek diversion. He's going to pretend it's practical, but it's not entirely practical. Nora said nothing. Just thought you should know, Pete said, and left. She went to the Kellerman place with Caleb on a Friday morning in early June, and it was practical. The creek diversion was a real problem, and Tom Kellerman's land was genuinely relevant to it. But Pete had been right that it was not entirely practical, and by the time they were walking back along the ridge above the valley in the late afternoon, the practicality had been covered some time ago, and they were talking about other things. She told him about her father's saddle shop in Ohio, about the way her mother had taught her to see fabric as geometry before she could see it as cloth. He told her about the first cattle drive he'd worked, at 16, a brutal July journey from Texas to Dodge City, in which he'd been sick for 11 of the 30 days, and too stubborn to admit it. They were talking like people do when they've moved past the early awkwardness of each other. And Nora was aware of this with a part of her that she kept carefully separate from the part that was managing the moment. At the top of the ridge, where you could see the whole valley laid out below, the patchwork of ranches, the dry creek beds, the town's small cluster of buildings catching the late light, Caleb stopped. He was looking at the valley. After a moment, he said, "It's a hard place." "Most good places are," Nora said. He looked at her. Not the assessing look he gave her work, something else, something more unguarded. "That's a particular way of seeing things. My mother's originally," she said. She said it about Ohio, and she wasn't wrong. What would she have said about this? He gestured at the valley. Nora looked at the brown hills, the too dry grass, the creek beds that should have had water in them. She would have said it had good bones, she said, that the rest was weather. Caleb stood there for a moment more. Then, "I'd like to keep seeing you." Nora turned to look at him directly. He was looking back at her with the same directness he brought to everything. No performance in it, no practiced delivery. "That's a plain way of saying it," she said. "I'm a plain man," he said. He wasn't apologizing for it. She thought about Margaret Hollis, about the laughter in the parlor, about the particular loneliness of building a life in a place that had never quite made room for her. She thought about what Ida Walsh's husband had relayed through Ida. He told me after that she was a capable woman who made him feel like property. "I'd like that too," she said. She kept her voice level, but it cost her something. Caleb nodded once, the way he did when he was filing information carefully. Below them, the valley was going gold in the late light, the kind of beautiful that happens right at the edge of difficult. And Nora stood there on the ridge in her practical shoes and her better dress, and looked at the land that had not yet decided what it thought of her. Whatever was coming, the talk, the pressure, the sharpened attention of people who had decided she did not belong, it was coming. She knew that as well as she knew leather. But standing here in this light, she let herself have the moment without apology. Just this, for now. Just this. 17. The talk started before the end of June. Nora had known it would. She'd lived in Red Hollow Valley long enough to understand the mechanics of how information traveled here. Not in straight lines, but in circles, picking up weight with each rotation. By the time a piece of news had made 3 full trips around the valley's social geography, it had usually acquired a motive, a villain, and a moral. So when Caleb began coming to the workroom on Tuesday afternoons, not for repairs or commissions, but simply to sit across the work table from her and talk, she knew the circles had already started turning. The first sign was Frank Dutton at the lumberyard. Nora went in on a Wednesday morning for 2 boards she needed to reinforce a workbench, and Frank, who had always been a decent enough man, sold her the boards without looking at her directly. He took her money, made change, and found something to occupy himself with on a shelf across the room before she'd finished gathering her purchase. It was a small thing, the kind of small thing that a person who hadn't been paying attention might have missed. Nora had always been paying attention. The second sign was Mrs. Gable, who ran the boarding house at the south end of Main Street and had previously been friendly in the brief, efficient way of women who are busy and haven't made up their minds about you yet. She made up her mind the first week of July. Nora passed her on the boardwalk outside the post office, and Mrs. Gable's eyes went somewhere above and slightly to the left of Nora's head. A social maneuver so practiced it must have taken years to perfect. The third sign was the commission she lost. It came from Caroline Voss, or rather, it didn't come from Caroline Voss because Caroline sent her housekeeper to cancel the order for a leather writing case that Nora had already started work on. The housekeeper delivered the cancellation with the expression of someone doing a job they'd not been consulted about, and Nora thanked her, folded the unfinished case back into its cloth, and went back to work. She charged Caroline nothing for the time already spent, because she had decided years ago not to let other people's bad behavior give her an excuse for her own. She told Caleb about the Voss cancellation on Tuesday afternoon, not as a complaint, more as information, because she'd decided early on that whatever this was between them, she was not going to manage his understanding of it. He needed to know the actual landscape. He listened with his hands flat on the table, which she had come to recognize as a sign that he was making himself stay still rather than react. When she finished, he said, "I'll talk to Caroline." "You won't," Nora said. He looked up. "If you go to Caroline Voss on my behalf, she'll tell every woman in the valley that I sent you, that I'm using you for protection. It'll make things worse in ways neither of us can undo." She held his gaze. "I'm not asking you to watch and do nothing forever. I'm asking you to let me handle my own business." He was quiet for a moment, then, "That's a hard thing to ask." "I know it is," she said. "I'm asking anyway." He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "All right," he said. It came out a little rough, like it cost him something. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. That was the thing about Caleb, the thing she was still getting used to. He actually listened. Not in the way that some men listened, where the listening was just waiting for you to finish so they could explain why you were wrong. He listened like her words were a piece of work he was evaluating carefully before he decided what he thought of them. It was disarming. She was not entirely accustomed to being disarmed. The rumors that circulated about her in July were specific enough that someone had been thinking about them seriously. The most durable one, the one with the most traction, because it had the clearest villain and the cleanest motive, was that Nora had set out deliberately to attach herself to Caleb Mercer from the moment she'd arrived in the valley 4 years ago, that the saddlebag had been calculated, that the repairs and commissions had been a long game. Margaret Hollis did not originate this version, as far as Nora could determine, but she did not discourage it either, and in the economy of valley gossip, silence was often the same as agreement. Pete Walsh told her about it directly, because Pete told her things directly, and she'd come to trust him for it. "I'm not going to soften it," he said, sitting in his usual chair in the workroom, holding a cup of coffee because he always seemed to produce coffee from somewhere. "Margaret's been saying you identified Caleb as a target before you ever laid eyes on him, that the bridal repair was the beginning of it." "The bridal repair happened 2 years before I knew he was even thinking about anything," Nora said. "I know that. Ida knows that. Most people who've thought about it for 30 seconds know that." He drank his coffee. "Margaret's not talking to people who think about it." Nora was quiet. Outside the workroom window, Main Street was doing its late morning business. A wagon, 2 women with baskets, the sound of the boot repairman working next door. The ordinary sounds of a town that was currently in the process of deciding what to think of her. "What does Caleb say about it?" she asked. "He says Margaret Hollis is a woman who knows how to protect her investments, and he doesn't fault her for it." Pete set the cup down. "Then he goes back to work." She absorbed this. It was the right response, not the response of a man performing indifference, but of someone who had categorized the situation accurately and wasn't going to spend energy on it that was needed elsewhere. She recognized the approach because it was roughly her own. She just wasn't sure if 2 people facing the same direction was the same thing as facing it together. She was still working this out when the situation got worse. The merchant who refused her was Jacob Plum, who ran the general store and who had been selling Nora her leather supplies, thread, and oil for 4 years. He didn't refuse her to her face. He was more careful than that. He simply stopped having what she needed. First, the particular weight of thread she ordered monthly. Then, the neat's foot oil. Then he mentioned, with an expression of genuine regret that she suspected was genuine, that his supplier in Billings was having difficulties, and he wasn't sure when the next shipment would arrive. She knew a lie from a truth, and she knew this was neither It was the particular middle territory of a man who had been pressured and was uncomfortable about it, but not uncomfortable enough to resist. She thanked him for telling her and left. The supplier in Billings was a man named Art Halsey, who she'd dealt with once before, and she wrote him a letter that same afternoon, ordering everything she'd been getting from Plum directly, with arrangements for pickup or delivery. Art Halsey wrote back within a week that he'd be glad of the business, and her first order would arrive by the end of July. She lost 2 weeks of supply, but she didn't lose the supply line, which was what mattered. She told none of this to Caleb. She was not hiding it from him. She was managing it, which was a different thing, and the difference was important to her even if it wouldn't have been visible from the outside. She was not waiting to be rescued. She had never in her life waited to be rescued, and she was not going to start now because a man with good hands and a steady voice had started coming by on Tuesday afternoons. What she did tell him was the other thing, the harder thing. The Kellerman place was failing faster than they'd calculated. Tom Kellerman had lost 40 head in the last 2 weeks of June, the cattle too weakened by the water shortage to survive a stretch of particularly brutal heat. He still wouldn't ask for help because Tom Kellerman was 54 years old and had survived worse than this, and his pride was the last thing still standing at full height on that property. But his wife Ruth had come to Nora's workroom on a Monday morning and sat in the chair where Pete usually sat and told her, in the blunt way of a woman past the point of sparing anyone's feelings, including her own, that they were in trouble. "Tom won't talk to Caleb," Ruth said. "He'd rather lose the rest of the cattle." "I know he would," Nora said. She'd been hearing some version of this for weeks. But if someone were to start work on that creek diversion without it being Tom's idea... Ruth paused. She was a square-built woman with the kind of face that had been through too many seasons to waste expression. If it were just a thing that got done, and Tom found out after it was already done, Nora looked at her. "You want me to ask Caleb?" "I want someone to do something," Ruth said. "I don't particularly care who it is." Nora went to the Double Horn that evening, not on a Tuesday and not with any particular care for appearances. She found Caleb in the barn with Pete, dealing with a horse that had thrown a shoe, and she waited until the shoe was dealt with before she described the Kellerman situation in full. She told him what Ruth had said. She told him her own assessment of the topography, that the diversion work could begin from the north side, technically on Double Horn land, without Tom Kellerman being involved until it was too far along to argue about. Caleb listened. He was wiping his hands on a cloth, and he stopped wiping and looked at the middle distance the way he did when he was thinking seriously. Then he said, "If I do work on my own property, and it happens to benefit the Kellerman place downhill, that's not charity." "That's correct," Nora said. "Tom can be angry about it." "He will be. For about 2 days, and then the water will be working and he'll find a way to forget that he was angry." Pete, who had been brushing the horse and appearing not to listen, said, "That's a fair read of Tom Kellerman." Caleb looked at Nora for a moment. Then he said, "You came out here on a Wednesday evening." She knew what he meant. They'd not spoken about appearances because they'd both silently agreed that the time for worrying about appearances had passed. But showing up at the Double Horn on a non-Tuesday, after dark, where anyone driving the North Road might see her horse tied outside the barn, that was a choice she'd made consciously. The Kellermans needed help, she said. Wednesday seemed close enough. Something moved in his face. Not a smile, not quite. Something warmer than that, and more complicated. He looked at his hands. "Can you stay for supper?" It was a plain question. He asked plain questions. "Yes," she said. The kitchen at the Double Horn was big and plain, and the cook, a wide man named Samuel, who'd worked the ranch since before Clara died, produced a meal without comment on Nora's presence, which she took as its own kind of acceptance. The three of them, Caleb, Pete, and Nora, ate at the big table and talked about the creek diversion, about the Kellermans, about the 3 other valley families in similar positions. By the end of the meal, they had the beginning of a plan, not just for the Kellerman place, but for a coordinated effort involving 6 families and a water-sharing arrangement that would require some of them to swallow their pride and most of them to do physical labor they hadn't planned on. "Some of them won't do it," Pete said, "even if it means losing cattle." "I know," Caleb said. "We offer it anyway." Nora had been thinking about something. She'd been thinking about it since Ruth Kellerman had sat in her workroom and said, "I don't particularly care who it is," and it had been forming itself into a specific shape over the last several days. She put her fork down. "The women will be easier to work with than the men," she said. Both of them looked at her. "The ranch wives, they don't have the same relationship to pride that their husbands do about this kind of help. If I go to them directly, explain the water arrangement, what it would mean, what it would cost, they'll have the conversations that matter." Caleb and Pete looked at each other. Pete said, "That is probably true." "It is true," Nora said. "I've been getting my supplies refused and my commissions canceled for 2 weeks by people who should know better, and not one of those ranch wives has been part of it. They have different concerns." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then, "You've been having your commissions canceled?" She'd not intended to say that. It had come out in the rhythm of making an argument, and now she couldn't take it back. She met his eyes. "I told you I was handling my own business." "You did," he said carefully. "I'm still handling it. I told you as context, not as a complaint." He held her gaze. There was something tight around his eyes that she recognized as the same thing she'd seen when she told him not to go to Caroline Voss. That particular cost of being asked to hold still when every instinct said otherwise. "All right," he said again, still a little rough. She reached across the table and put her hand on his for just a moment. It was the first time she'd touched him deliberately, and they were both aware of it. Then she took her hand back and picked up her fork. "The women," she said. "I'll start with Ruth Kellerman and work out from there." She spent the next 2 weeks doing exactly that. She rode out to 6 properties, sometimes in the early morning before the heat built, sometimes in the long evenings when the light turned gold and forgiving. She sat in ranch house kitchens and talked to women who were tired and worried and had been told that everything was fine by men who believed that saying so made it true. She brought her drawings of the water diversion. She'd made clean copies on good paper, and she explained the mechanics simply and answered questions without condescension. She did not minimize how much work it would take. She did not promise it would fix everything. She said this is what the land can do if the people on it cooperate, and she said it in the voice of a woman who had spent 4 years looking at how things were actually made. By the middle of July, 4 of the 6 families had committed. Tom Kellerman found out about the diversion work when it was already 3 days in, and he was angry for exactly 2 days. And on the 3rd day, he came out with a shovel and didn't speak to anyone but worked harder than men half his age. The 5th family came in the following week when they saw what was happening on the Kellerman place. The 6th never came in, but their cattle survived the summer because the water table in the area had shifted enough by then. None of it was clean. None of it went smoothly. There were arguments about who was responsible for which section of channel, one fistfight between 2 ranch hands that had been building for reasons unrelated to water, a section of the diversion that collapsed twice before Pete figured out the soil composition was different than it looked. Nora got the wrong leather shipment from Billings in the middle of it all and had to spend 3 days she didn't have sorting it out by mail. Caleb got a fever in late July that lasted 5 days, and which he refused to treat with appropriate seriousness, and Pete told her about it in the way of a man reporting a situation that is slightly out of his control. She rode out to the Double Horn and found Caleb at his desk working on ledgers, pale and obviously not well, and she said, "Pete tells me you have a fever." "It's manageable," Caleb said without looking up. "You look like something the creek washed up." He did look up at that. After a moment he said, "That's not a kind thing to say." "I'm not trying to be kind," she said. "I'm trying to get you to go to bed." He looked at her for a long moment with those tired, fevered eyes. "You're a particular kind of stubborn," he said. "I learned from good people," she said. She took the ledger from his hands, which he allowed, and she set it on the shelf. "Bed. I'll tell Samuel to make broth." He went to bed. Not without argument, but he went. She sat in the kitchen with Samuel and talked about the ranch while the broth heated, and Samuel, who had not volunteered information about anything in the time she'd been coming to the Double Horn, told her that Clara had been fond of the window on the south side of the house because you could see the whole valley from it in the morning. He said it in the way of a man offering something, not just filling silence. She thanked him for it. She did not stay the night. She left before supper because whatever the valley thought of her, she was not going to give it an easy argument. But she came back the following morning, and the morning after, until the fever broke and Caleb was sitting up and irritable and obviously recovering. And the irritability was such a relief after the pale stillness of the sick days that she found herself laughing at something he said. and he looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face before. Something open and unguarded that lasted only a moment before he got it back under control. In the second week of August, Margaret Hollis came to the workroom again. She didn't sit this time. She stood in the middle of the small space and looked at Nora with something that had moved beyond strategy into something rawer. "You're making a fool of yourself," she said. "And him." "I'm working on a water project with 6 ranching families," Nora said. "I'm not sure how that makes either of us foolish." "That's not what the Valley sees. The Valley sees what's convenient," Nora said. She kept her voice level. "The water project is going to save livestock that would otherwise die this summer. Whatever the Valley decides to see, the cattle will still be alive." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Her jaw was tight. "He'll come to his senses." "Maybe," Nora said. She looked at her directly. "Or maybe what looks like a lapse in sense to you looks different from where he's standing. I can't speak for him." "You speak for yourself clearly enough." "I try to," Nora said. Margaret left without another word. Through the window, Nora watched her walk up the street, straight-backed and deliberate. A woman who had not gotten what she came for and was working out what to try next. She felt something watching her go. Not satisfaction, not quite. Something more complicated. A recognition, maybe, of how much Margaret Hollis had built her understanding of the world on the assumption that certain equations were fixed, and how difficult it must be when one of the variables turned out to be negotiable after all. She turned back to her table. There was a leather panel half cut in front of her, waiting. She picked up the knife and went back to work. The fire started on a Thursday. It began the way most catastrophes in Red Hollow Valley began. Not with drama, but with an ordinary failure. A lantern knocked from a fence post on the Grady property, southeast of town, in the last week of August when the grass had been drought dry for 3 months and the wind had been coming hard out of the northwest since noon. By the time the Grady boy got to the well and back, the fence line was gone. By the time his father made it outside, the south pasture was burning. Nora was in her workroom when she smelled it. She'd worked late because she had 2 commissions with deadlines and the light in the evenings had been good. She set down her knife at the smell. Not the ordinary smoke smell of cook fires or the blacksmith 2 streets over, but something larger and more indiscriminate. The kind of smell that tells you fire has gotten past the point where any single person was in charge of it. She went to the window and saw the orange line along the southern ridge. She stood there for approximately 4 seconds. Then she put on her boots, her heavier coat, tied her hair back with a strip of leather from the scrap bin, and went outside. Main Street was already beginning to fracture. A few men running south toward the glow, a woman pulling children back from a doorway, someone on horseback moving fast without apparent direction. The chaos of the first 10 minutes of a disaster, before anyone has assessed what they're actually dealing with, had a particular character that Nora recognized from a mill fire in Ohio when she was 14. The panic itself wasn't the danger. The panic was just noise. The danger was the specific geography of the fire, the wind direction, and what lay between here and there. She found Jake Odom, one of Caleb's ranch hands, saddling a horse outside the livery. "Jake," she said, "which way is the wind carrying it?" Jake was 18 and frightened, and he looked at her with the particular expression of someone who is relieved to be asked a direct question. "Northwest," he said, "moving fast. It's already past the Grady South fence." "The Double Horn is northwest of the Grady place." "Yes, ma'am." She thought for 3 seconds. The Double Horn South pasture shared a fence line with 2 smaller operations, the Birch family's place and Old Henry Sauer's 20 acres. Between the fire's current position and the Double Horn was approximately 2 miles of dry grassland with nothing substantial to stop it if the wind held. Caleb's crew would know the fire was coming. What they would not necessarily know was how to coordinate with the families in its path. "Get me a horse," she said to Jake. "Miss Whitfield." "Jake, get me a horse." He got her a horse. She rode south first, not north, because north was where Caleb was and Caleb had experienced hands and resources. South was where the Birch family was, Martin and Vera Birch, 3 children, 1 hired hand. And south was directly in the fire's path. She smelled the smoke thickening before she was halfway there, and the orange on the horizon had stopped being a line and started being a shape, something with depth and movement, and the wind was hot and carrying ash. The horse didn't like it, and she didn't blame the horse. The Birch place was already partially evacuated when she arrived, which was the good news. The bad news was that Martin Birch was trying to move his cattle alone, 60 head of confused and frightened animals that did not want to go north, and his hired hand was on the roof of the barn, wetting it down with buckets in a way that was going to matter for approximately 20 more minutes before it stopped mattering. Vera Birch was in the yard with the 3 children, and a look on her face that Nora recognized. Not panic exactly, the state past panic, where a person has used up their fear and is operating on something colder and more mechanical. Martin won't leave the cattle, Vera said when she saw Nora. The cattle can't all be moved by one man, Nora said. How many can he get out in the next 15 minutes? Maybe 20. Then 20 it is. She looked at the hired hand on the roof. Tell him to get down. Wetting the roof won't save it if the grass around it goes. She looked back at Vera. North Road, toward the double horn. Go now with the children. Martin takes 20 head and follows. The rest of the cattle we can't help tonight. Vera Birch looked at her. Something moved across her face. Not gratitude exactly. Something more raw than that. The look of a person who needed someone to make the call they couldn't make themselves. Those are his cattle, she said. I know they are, Nora said. Go. Vera went. Nora rode to Martin, who was red-faced and sweating and in the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that losing his cattle was something he could not absorb. She said his name twice before he heard her. Martin, you cannot save all of them. You can save 20. Which 20? He stared at her. The fire was close enough now that the south sky was orange all the way to the top of the horizon, and the heat was a physical presence. I'm not leaving them, he said. You're not leaving them. You're leaving 40 of them to save 20 and your barn and your family. She held his gaze. Which 20, Martin? Tell me now. He told her. They cut the 20 from the herd in less time than she expected. Martin knew his cattle and worked them hard, and she kept pace with him. And she drove them north while he took one last circuit of the barn, doing something with the water trough that probably didn't help but that he needed to do. They were on the north road 3 minutes later. The fire took the Birch south pasture while they were still close enough to hear it. Martin didn't look back. She could see his jaw working, the way a man's jaw works when he's holding something in that needs to stay held. The grass will grow back, she said. He didn't answer, but he didn't stop riding. Henry Sauer was already gone when she passed his property. She could see the house shuttered and the small yard empty, which meant either he'd left on his own or someone had gotten to him first. She didn't stop. She turned north toward the double horn. She could see the ranch from half a mile out, and what she saw was controlled disorder, the kind that means people are working rather than fleeing. There were lanterns moving in the east pasture, the shapes of men and horses against the orange sky, and she could hear shouting that had the particular cadence of shouting with a purpose. Caleb was visible near the east gate, not shouting but moving from person to person with a rapid, specific quality of motion that she recognized as command. He saw her coming and met her at the fence. He looked her over. A quick, complete assessment before he spoke. You came from the Birch place. Martin's on the north road with 20 head and his family. The south pasture is gone. Something crossed his face. Henry Sauer? Already out, looks like. His nephew came for him an hour ago. He was already turning back toward the east pasture. I've got my crew on the east fire break. If we can hold the line at the creek bed. The creek bed's dry, she said. I know it's dry. We're using the dry channel as a break, clearing the grass on both sides. It won't stop everything, but it'll slow it. He glanced at her. You need to go north, into town. I came to help. I know you did. He stopped and looked at her directly, and there was something in his face that was not command and not courtesy, something that cost him more than either. Nora, please go north. Caleb, I am not going to sit in town while your ranch burns. She said it quietly, without dramatics, just a statement of what was true. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire was visible behind her now. She could see it in his eyes, the orange reflection of it. And the wind had picked up in the last 20 minutes, and the smoke was heavy and real. He said, Stay with Pete, do what he says. All right, she said. I mean it. So do I. She found Pete at the water wagon directing 2 ranch hands on the placement of wet burlap along the east fence line. Pete looked at her, looked at the fire, looked back at her. You rode through that to get here. Mostly around it. What do you need? He asked, which was the right question and which she would remember later as one of the things she respected most about Pete Walsh. Tell me where the gaps are. He told her. The Double Horn's firebreak plan was solid on the east side, where Caleb's crew had been working since the fire was spotted. The west side was thinner, 2 men on a long stretch of fence line, not enough hands to clear the grass and maintain the burlap line both. And there was a complication. 3 of the itinerant workers who'd been hired for the late summer fence repairs were camping on the far west section of the property. They'd been sent a rider, but the rider hadn't come back yet. The camp is in a hollow, Pete said. If the fire comes around the west ridge, it'll come down into it. Nora thought about the topography she'd walked with Caleb 3 months ago. The hollow Pete was describing. She could see it in her memory, the way the land dipped below the west ridge, the dry grass, thick and long because it was sheltered from the grazing rotation. If the fire crested that ridge with the wind behind it, the hollow would fill like a bowl. I'll go, she said. Nora, I know the way. I've walked it. She was already turning her horse. Send someone to reinforce the west fence line. I'll get the workers out and come back. If the wind shifts, I know, she said. Send someone to the fence line. She didn't wait for his answer. The ride to the west camp was the longest 12 minutes of her life. The smoke was thicker on this side of the property, coming in low and making the horse reluctant, and her eyes water badly enough that she was navigating partly by memory. The orange on the sky to the south had become the whole southern sky, and she could hear the fire now. Not a crackling, the way people described small fires, but a sustained roar with a kind of breathing in it, like something alive and hungry, and not particularly patient. She found the camp by the smell of their cook fire, which under the circumstances was almost funny. 3 men, 2 young, 1 older, all of them Mexican workers named Rafael, Domingo, and a man everyone called Tio because Nora never heard anyone use his actual name, standing at the edge of the hollow looking at the south sky with the expressions of people who have understood the situation but not yet decided what to do about it. Rafael was the first to see her. He said something in Spanish she didn't fully catch, but the tone was unmistakable, relief, with an edge of urgency. We go north, she said. Right now. Leave everything. Tio said something. Rafael translated. He says the horses. There were 2 horses tethered at the camp. Yes, she said. Horses too. Nothing else. Move. They moved. Tio didn't need a translation for the tone of her voice, and he was untying the horses before she'd finished the sentence. Domingo kicked dirt over the cook fire with the instinct of someone who understood fires, which under current circumstances was either useful habit or bleak irony. They were moving north out of the hollow when the wind shifted. Not dramatically, not the way it happened in stories, a sudden reversal that changed everything in an instant. It was a stutter, a hesitation in the northwest wind that lasted maybe 15 seconds before it came back. But in those 15 seconds, the smoke that had been moving away from them swung sideways and south. And for one terrible moment, Nora could not see the north ridge at all. Only gray-brown smoke and orange light from somewhere she couldn't locate. The horse under her made a sound she'd never heard a horse make before and tried to turn back. She held it. She held it with everything she had, her arms burning with the effort, and she said to the horse in a voice that was lower and steadier than she felt, "Not that way. Come on. Come on." The horse came on. The 15 seconds ended. The wind came back northwest and the smoke cleared enough to show her the north ridge, and they rode hard for it, all 5 of them. Nora, Rafael, Domingo, Tio, the 2 camp horses running loose and keeping pace with a survival instinct that needed no direction. They came over the north ridge coughing and ash-covered and alive. Pete was at the west fence line when they came down. He looked at Nora and then at the 3 men and then back at Nora, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who had been waiting to find out whether he'd made a terrible mistake and had just found out he hadn't. "The wind shifted," he said. "Briefly," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. The smoke had gotten into her throat. "It's back northwest. Caleb's holding the east brake." He looked at her again more carefully. "You're all right?" "I'm fine." She was not entirely fine, Shrun. Her eyes were streaming and her arms were shaking from the horse, but fine enough. "What do you need?" They worked through the night. Not just Caleb's crew. By midnight, there were 30 people on the Double Horn's fire break, because word had traveled the way bad news always traveled in the valley, fast and specific. And the families who'd been part of the summer's water project showed up with tools and hands, and in Tom Kellerman's case, a wagon loaded with burlap and water barrels that he'd brought without anyone asking and without saying a word about it to anyone. He just arrived and started working. Nora worked the west fence line with Pete's crew until 2 in the morning, when the wind finally dropped and the fire's progress slowed to something the break could hold. She was covered in ash and her better coat was probably finished, and at some point in the third hour she'd burned the side of her right hand badly enough that someone, she didn't see who, wrapped it in wet cloth without being asked, and she kept working. At 2:30, Caleb found her at the water wagon. He was dirty in a way that suggested he'd been closer to the fire than was strictly wise, and there was a long scorch mark on his left sleeve that made her stomach drop before she confirmed that the arm inside it appeared intact. He looked at her wrapped hand. She looked at his sleeve. Neither of them said anything about either thing for a moment. "The east break held," he said. "I heard. The west pasture grass is mostly gone, some fence line." He was taking inventory, the way he did when he needed to process something by listing it. "The barn's fine. The cattle are, most of them." A pause. "Martin Birch's south pasture." "I know," she said, "and the Grady place." His jaw tightened. They lost the house. She absorbed that. The Gradys. She knew them slightly, a young couple with a baby, newcomers to the valley. Were they out? They were out. Everyone's out. He said it with a weight that told her how close it hadn't been. "Raphael told Pete you went into the hollow when the wind was already shifting." She didn't answer. "Nora." "The men were there," she said. "Someone had to go." He looked at her for a long time. The fire was mostly behind them now, reduced to a dull glow on the southern horizon, and the air still tasted of smoke and ash. But the roaring had stopped, and in its place was a kind of exhausted silence. The silence of a thing that had spent itself and left damage behind. Caleb's face in the lantern light was tired and dirty and marked with something she couldn't quite name. "When I couldn't see you," he said, and then he stopped. She waited. "When I couldn't see you for about an hour," he said again, and stopped again. She understood that he wasn't going to finish the sentence. She understood what the unfinished sentence contained. She reached out and took hold of his wrist, just below the burned sleeve, and she held on for a moment. His hand closed over hers. Carefully, because of the burn. They stood there like that in the ash-gray dark, with the smell of smoke still heavy in the air, and Tom Kellerman's wagon 20 feet away and Pete's crew somewhere nearby, and the whole tired, damaged valley spread out around them. Not a perfect moment. Not even close to a perfect moment. But it was theirs, completely, and neither of them let go. It was Raphael who broke it, not deliberately, just by appearing out of the dark to ask Pete something and stopping short when he saw them, and then retreating with a speed and tact that suggested a man who knew when he'd walked into the wrong moment. Nora let go of Caleb's wrist. He kept hold of her hand a second longer. Then he released it. "Your coat is finished," he said, looking at it. "I know," she said. "I'll get you another one." "You don't need to do that." "I know I don't." He looked at her steadily. "I'm going to." She thought about arguing and decided it was not the hill she needed to die on tonight. "All right," she said. Something almost like a smile moved across his exhausted face. He reached out and took a piece of ash from her hair, a small, deliberate gesture, and then he turned back toward the east fence line where his crew was checking the break in the gray early light. Nora stood at the water wagon alone for a moment, her burned hand wrapped in wet cloth, her coat ruined, her throat raw with smoke, and watched the sun begin to come up over the eastern ridge. It came up the way it always did in this valley. Not gently, not gradually, but all at once, light falling across the damaged land with a bluntness that showed everything: the burned grass, the broken fence lines, the ash-covered faces of 30 people who had stayed when they didn't have to. And in that light, in that hard, specific morning light, there was also this: Tom Kellerman setting down a water bucket and saying something to Martin Birch, and Martin Birch nodding, and the two of them standing there together in the ash looking at the valley they'd both lost pieces of overnight and would spend the next season rebuilding. Theo sitting on the wagon bed, eating something Samuel had brought from the ranch kitchen, saying something to Domingo that made Domingo laugh. A short, exhausted laugh that nonetheless was a laugh. The valley still standing. Nora picked up a bucket and went back to work. The valley looked different in the weeks after the fire. Not just the physical landscape, though that had changed too. The burned south section stripped down to bare earth, the fence lines that needed rebuilding, the Grady house, a blackened foundation that the young couple was still figuring out what to do about. But something else had shifted. Something in the way people moved through the town and looked at each other in the street. The particular quality of a community that has been through something together and is still working out what it means. Nora noticed it first at the dry goods store. She'd gone in for thread, her regular supply, the same order she'd placed every month for 4 years. And Frank Dutton, who had spent 2 months finding reasons not to look directly at her, looked directly at her. He didn't say anything notable. He asked what she needed, he got it, he made change. But when she picked up the package and turned to go, he said, "My boy told me what you did at the Birch place." He said it to the counter, not quite to her face, but he said it. That was a decent thing. Nora stood there for a moment. "Martin did the hard part," she said. "I just asked the right question." Frank nodded, still at the counter. "Still," he said. She thanked him and left and stood outside on the boardwalk for a moment in the September morning air, which was cooler now that August had finally loosened its grip, and she thought about the word still. How much weight a single word could carry when the person saying it was not accustomed to carrying weight. It was not an apology. She wasn't looking for apologies, but it was something. The beginning of a recalibration, a small and slightly uncomfortable adjustment in the way Frank Dutton understood the world, and she found that she could accept it without needing it to be more than it was. The recalibrations were happening all over the valley, at different speeds and with different degrees of discomfort, and they were happening because people had been talking. Not the circular gossip talk of the spring and summer, something more deliberate. Raphael had told Pete's story. Pete had told Caleb's. Martin Birch had told anyone who'd sit still long enough about the 20 head, and the woman who'd asked him which 20 with the fire already visible on the horizon. Tom Kellerman hadn't told anyone anything directly, but Tom Kellerman had shown up at the fire break with a wagon of supplies at midnight without being asked, and that was its own kind of testimony. The story of the West Hollow, Nora riding into it when the wind was shifting, bringing out 3 men and 2 horses, traveled through the valley in the specific way that stories about physical courage travel, which is faster and more intact than most stories, because the facts were simple enough that embellishment wasn't necessary and the witnesses were credible. Raphael told it to the workers at the rebuilt fence line. The fence workers told it in town. Within 2 weeks of the fire, there were people in Red Hollow Valley who had never spoken to Nora Whitfield describing what she had done with more accuracy than she would have described it herself. She knew this was happening. She was not unaffected by it, but she kept her workroom open and her head down and her prices what they had always been. Because the worst thing she could do was let the change in the valley's temperature make her act differently than she had always acted. The value of being consistent was that people couldn't explain it as performance. You did the same thing for long enough and it stopped being a thing you were doing and started being a thing you were. The commission that arrived from Caroline Voss's housekeeper in the second week of September was for a leather writing case. The same order that had been canceled in July, reinstated without comment, accompanied by full payment in advance, which was not how Caroline had handled previous commissions. Nora made the case. She made it well, the same quality she'd have given it in July, because the quality of her work was not contingent on whether the person receiving it had behaved correctly. She delivered it to the Voss house, handed it to the housekeeper, and rode back to town. She did not feel vindicated. She felt tired and a little sad, the way you feel when something that should have been simple all along finally becomes simple too late. Caleb came to the workroom on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week of September, which was their established pattern. But he came earlier than usual, and he had something with him, the saddlebag. He set it on the work table and stood there with his hat in his hands and looked at it. Nora looked at it too. She hadn't seen it up close since she'd made it, and 4 months of daily ranch use had given it a character it hadn't had when she'd handed it over. The leather had darkened and settled into its own particular creases. The latch showed the wear of 1,000 openings and closings, and the compass rose tooling on the flap had softened at the edges. It looked like a thing that had been used. She found this more satisfying than she expected. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. She waited. "The night of the fire, when I was working the East Break." He was looking at the bag, not at her. "I had the emergency plans in here. The fire break layout, the water points, the evacuation routes I'd worked out last spring when the drought got serious." He paused. "Pete's copies, the ones you helped me think through." "I know," she said. "You told me you kept them in there." "What I didn't tell you—" He stopped, turned the bag over in his hands. There was a moment, about 11 o'clock, when the East Break almost didn't hold. Section of it went. Wind change. The burlap caught and burned. I had maybe 4 minutes to redirect the crew before the fire came through. He looked up at her. "I had the plans. I knew exactly where the secondary water points were, which sections of fence line were stone and which were wood, where the cattle were positioned. 4 minutes was enough because I had that information in my hands." Nora sat with this. "Without the plans, it would have been slower," he said. "I might have gotten there, maybe, but the plans made the difference between maybe and yes." "The plans were your work," she said. "You and Pete drew them. You told us to draw them. Last spring, when we were talking about the water project. You said a ranch Caleb's size should have emergency documentation, and you said it like it was obvious. And I went home and thought about it and spent a week putting it together." He held her gaze. "The bag was already part of how I worked. It made sense to keep the plans there. Accessible, protected." "Caleb," she said his name quietly. "You don't need to give me credit for your preparation." "I'm not giving you credit," he said. He said it with a firmness that stopped her. "I'm telling you what happened. There's a difference." He set the bag down on the table between them. "Everyone in this valley spent months deciding what you were and what you wanted and what you were capable of, and they were wrong. Not because you did something dramatic, but because you'd been doing the right thing quietly for months before anyone was paying attention." He looked at her steadily. "I've been paying attention." She looked at the bag on the table. The darkened leather, the worn latch, the softened compass rose. She thought about the 6 weeks she'd spent making it, the 3 prototypes before the 4th was right, the particular problem she'd been trying to solve. She thought about handing it to Caleb in Margaret Hollis's parlor and the laughter that had come from behind him, and the way he had worked the latch, click, click, as though the laughter were happening in a different room. She was not going to cry. She was 30 years old and she had been through enough that she knew the difference between a moment that deserved tears and a moment that deserved a clear head, and this was the latter. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back, not echoing, acknowledging. The town meeting to discuss the fire recovery was held in the second week of October at the community hall on the east side of Main Street, which was a large, drafty building that smelled of old wood and was cold enough in the fall that people kept their coats on. Everyone came. It was the kind of event that required presence the way funerals required presence. Not attending was its own statement, and nobody wanted to make that statement right now. Nora sat in the 3rd row with Ida Walsh, who had attached herself to Nora at the door, with the determined warmth of a woman who had been waiting for an opportunity to make a public statement about something. Pete sat on Ida's other side, and beyond Pete sat Tom Kellerman with his wife Ruth, and beyond them were the Birches and the Sowers and the families from the water project, and approximately 350 other people filling the hall to its cold, drafty capacity. Margaret Hollis was in the 2nd row, on the other side of the hall. Nora saw her when she sat down, and Margaret saw her at the same moment, and there was a brief exchange of eye contact that communicated several things, none of which required words. Margaret looked away first. Bess McAllister, who had laughed the smallest laugh in Margaret's parlor and regretted it the most visibly, had apparently done something about her regret. She was sitting with the Birch family 3 rows back, and when Nora came in, she raised a hand in a greeting that was deliberate and public and cost her something. Nora nodded back. The meeting was run by Thomas Adler, the valley's informal mayor. He had no official title, just the accumulated weight of being the oldest established businessman in town and the only person everyone was willing to argue with. He was 67 and had the voice of a much larger man, and he called the meeting to order by rapping a table with a piece of wood and saying that they had a lot to talk about and not much heat to do it in. The practical portion of the meeting was exactly that, practical and long and sometimes contentious, because rebuilding a community after a fire involved money and labor and the distribution of both, and not everyone agreed on the proportions. The Grady house needed to be rebuilt first. There was general agreement on that. The birch fence line, the sour south pasture, 3 sections of road that had been damaged in the fire response effort. Thomas Adler wrote figures on a board and argued about them with 3 different people simultaneously, which appeared to be his natural mode of operation. Nora sat and listened and said nothing in this portion, because it wasn't her property and the decisions weren't hers to make. But she watched the room, the way people positioned themselves relative to each other, the small negotiations happening in whispers along the rows. She watched Caleb, who was near the front and who spoke twice, once about the fence line costs and once about the road repairs, in the direct, unsentimental way he brought to everything. And both times people listened without the particular quality of restlessness that meetings produced when someone spoke too long. It was Martin Birch who changed the character of the meeting. He stood up in the middle of a discussion about the community fund contributions, which was getting heated because Jacob Plum thought the merchants should contribute proportionally less than the ranchers. And he said, "I need to say something before we talk about money anymore." Thomas Adler said, "Go ahead, Martin." Martin Birch was not a natural public speaker. He was a rancher, a man of physical work and physical language, and standing in front of 350 people, he looked uncomfortable in a way that was clearly real and not a performance. He held his hat in his hands and looked at the floor for a moment before he looked up. "I had 60 head going into the fire," he said. "I was going to lose them all. I was standing in my south pasture watching the fire come, and I had already decided, I don't know what I had decided, something stubborn and stupid, that I was going to stay with the cattle." He paused. "Nora Whitfield rode onto my property, and she asked me which 20 I could save, and she asked it in a way that made it a real question with a real answer, and I gave her the answer, and we moved 20 head in about 15 minutes. He looked up and found Nora in the 3rd row. "I still have those 20 cattle," he said, "and I still have my family because my wife was already moving by the time I got my head straight. That's because Nora told her to go." He looked back down at his hat. "I don't know why she came to my place first. I hadn't been kind to her. Most of us hadn't." A long pause. I wanted to say that out loud, in front of everybody. The hall was quiet. Not the restless quiet of a crowd waiting for something. A different kind. The quiet of people who have been told something true and are sitting with the discomfort of recognizing it. Then Raphael, who was sitting near the back with Domingo and Tio, and had not been expected to speak at a community meeting that was not, technically, his community, stood up. He spoke in English carefully, with Pete translating the 2 words he got wrong, and he described the hollow and the wind shift and the woman on horseback who had come through the smoke and said, "We go north, right now, leave everything." He sat back down. Then Ruth Kellerman stood up, without looking at Tom, and said that if Nora Whitfield hadn't come to her kitchen in June and sat down with the water diversion plans and explained them like she believed the outcome mattered, her family's cattle would not have survived the summer. She sat down, and Tom Kellerman, beside her, was looking at the floor, and after a moment he reached over and put his hand on hers, which was not a thing Tom Kellerman did in public. Nora sat in the 3rd row and kept her face still, and felt Ida Walsh's hand close around her wrist and squeeze once, and let go. Thomas Adler let the room sit in its quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Caleb, you had something to say." Caleb stood up. He turned to face the room rather than the board, the way he did when he was saying something that needed to be heard rather than noted. "The night of the fire," he said, "I was working the east fire break. I had the ranch plans, the emergency documentation, the water points, the evacuation routes." He paused. "I had them in the saddlebag." He didn't need to say more than that. The room knew the bag. Half the town had heard about the bag by now, in some version or other. 4 minutes to redirect the crew when the break almost went. 4 minutes was enough because I had what I needed, where I needed it, in a form I could use in the dark and the smoke. He looked out at the hall. The bag was Nora's work. The plans were partly her thinking. I want the valley to know that. He sat down. The room's silence had a different texture now. Less the quiet of discomfort, and more the quiet of people recalculating, adjusting the figures in an equation that had been running on wrong assumptions. Margaret Hollis was looking at the wall above the board. Her face was composed. She was too controlled a person for her face to do what it wanted to do in a public room, but her hands, folded in her lap, were tight enough that her knuckles had gone pale. Nora noticed this not with satisfaction, but with something more complicated, something that recognized the cost of being wrong about something you'd been certain of, and had a small, involuntary sympathy for it even when the person who was wrong had made your life harder for it. She did not feel sorry for Margaret, but she understood the specific texture of that moment, the private recalibration happening in the second row, and she did not kick at it. Thomas Adler brought the meeting back to practical matters. It had to be done. There was still a community fund to organize and a house to rebuild, and the rest of the evening was logistics. But the quality of the room had changed in a way that those present would carry with them longer than the decisions about fence line repairs and merchant contributions. Afterward, in the cold outside the hall, Bess McAllister found Nora in the crowd. She was a small woman, and she had to work a little to get through the press of people, and when she got there, she looked at Nora with an expression that had clearly been worked on and was not entirely succeeding. "I owe you an apology," she said, "for the gathering, in May." Nora looked at her. Bess McAllister had laughed the smallest laugh. She had also looked uncomfortable the fastest and stopped the soonest. There were gradations to these things. "You don't owe me anything," Nora said, and meant it. "We were strangers." "That's generous," Bess said. "It's accurate," Nora said. "If you want to not be strangers now, that's different." Bess blinked. Then something in her face relaxed, the particular ease of a person who had been prepared for harder judgment and received something more workable. "I'd like that," she said. "Good," Nora said. She found Caleb at the edge of the crowd, talking to Pete and Tom Kellerman. Tom Kellerman was doing a thing with his jaw that suggested he was deciding whether to say something he'd been holding for a while. When Nora approached, he looked at her directly. Tom, who had brought the wagon at midnight and not said a word. And he said, "The diversion's going to need maintenance before winter." "I know," she said. "I'm willing to do the north section if someone handles the channel near Birch's east line." "Martin will do it," Nora said. "I'll ask him." Tom nodded once, the way men of few words nodded when a thing had been settled. He looked like he might say something more, and then apparently decided that what had been said was sufficient. He turned back to Pete. Caleb was watching her with an expression she recognized by now. Quiet, complete, taking her in with the same attention he gave everything he valued. She met his eyes. "Long evening," he said. "Good one, though," she said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. The crowd was thinning around them, people heading home in the cold October night, their breath visible in the lantern light outside the hall. "Come to the ranch for supper this week, not Tuesday, whenever you want." She looked at him. He was not performing the invitation. He was issuing it the way he issued everything, plainly, without decoration, meaning exactly what he said. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She walked back to her workroom alone through the cold night, the stars sharp and clean above the valley, the smell of smoke still faint in the air if you were looking for it. The burned south sections were invisible in the dark. By morning they would be there again, the bare earth, the work ahead. But in this particular darkness, the valley looked the way it always had. The way it had looked on that ridge in June when Caleb had said it was a hard place, and she had said most good places were. She let herself in, lit the lamp, and stood for a moment in the small, familiar space. The work table, the tools, the scrap bin, the chair where Pete always sat and drank coffee he'd produced from nowhere. The leather panel she'd been working on before the fire was still there, waiting. She sat down and picked up the knife. She was not finished here, not even close. Thursday's supper at the Double Horn became a regular thing, and neither of them announced it or made a point of it, because the kind of people they were did not make points of things. It simply became true the way most real things became true. Through repetition, through the accumulation of ordinary evenings that added up to something neither ordinary nor accidental. Samuel cooked. Samuel always cooked, and he had a gift for pretending not to notice what was happening in his kitchen while noticing everything. He set 3 places when Pete stayed, 2 when he didn't, and he produced food that was plain and good and never commented on anything. Nora had come to understand that Samuel's silence was not absence. It was a particular kind of presence. The presence of a man who had worked the Double Horn through Clara's life and Clara's death, and the 2 quiet years after, and who had his own feelings about what happened in the main house that he was too careful and too decent to impose on anyone. One Thursday in November, she arrived to find him in the kitchen yard, doing something complicated with a bridle that had broken in an awkward place. She looked at it for a moment and said, "I can fix that." He handed it to her without a word. She sat on the kitchen step and worked at the bridle for 20 minutes while he watched, and at the end of it, he took the repaired thing and turned it over in his hands the way Caleb always turned her work over. And he said, "Clara used to make preserves for the hands at Christmas. 12 jars, same every year. Peach." Nora looked up at him. "I'm just saying," he said, and went back inside. She sat on the kitchen step for a moment with the feeling that something had been offered to her. Not approval exactly, something more particular than that. An inclusion. She accepted it quietly and followed him in. The burn on her right hand healed badly at first, and then, grudgingly, correctly. She had 2 weeks in October when she couldn't do fine stitching, which cost her time she didn't have, and she worked around it with a stubbornness that Pete observed and did not comment on, and Caleb observed and also did not comment on, because by now they both understood that commenting on Nora's management of her own difficulties was a waste of everyone's time. The scar it left was a coin-sized patch on the side of her palm that would probably never fully smooth out. She didn't particularly mind. She'd earned it. The Grady house went up in November, faster than expected, because half the valley showed up on the first Saturday of the rebuild, and the other half showed up on the second. Young Daniel Grady, who was 24 and had not been in the valley long enough to have strong opinions about anyone, told anyone who asked that he'd never seen anything like it, and people who had lived in Red Hollow Valley for 20 years and remembered harder times said it was not usual, not entirely, but that some years were different from other years. Nora went both Saturdays. She was not a carpenter and she was not a builder, but she could hold a board level and hand tools and make coffee and cut leather hinges for the cabinet doors that Daniel's wife had picked out. And she did all of these things without needing to be asked and without needing them to mean something they didn't mean. The work was the work. That was enough. That was... Margaret Hollis came the second Saturday. She arrived late in the morning and she brought food. A proper contribution, 2 pies and a pot of beans. And she worked in the way of a woman who understood that the time for a certain kind of behavior had passed without anyone having to tell her directly. She did not speak to Nora beyond what was necessary, and Nora did not seek her out, and they moved around each other in the way of 2 people who have accepted a shared geography without yet knowing what to do with the closeness. It was Bess McAllister who finally named what had been happening over the previous months, at least named it to Nora's face. She'd started coming to the workroom in October, not for commissions, just to talk, in the way that women in the valley talk to each other when they were deciding whether someone was going to be a real part of their lives. Bess was not a complicated person. She was straightforward and kind and occasionally said things out loud that other people only thought, which Nora found more refreshing than she'd expected. "The whole valley got you wrong," Bess said one afternoon in December, sitting in Pete's chair with a cup of coffee that she had brought herself, which was a thing Nora now understood was a custom in this valley. People brought their own coffee to your workroom as a form of social offering. Not just Margaret, all of us. "People usually get each other wrong the first time," Nora said. She was working on a commission, not looking up. "That's not particular to this valley. We were unkind about it," Bess said. "That part is particular." Nora set down the knife. She thought about how to say what she wanted to say in a way that was honest without being a lecture. "You saw what you expected to see," she said finally. "A woman without property, without family connections, showing up somewhere she hadn't been invited. The story wrote itself before I opened my mouth." "That's generous again." "It's not generous, it's just... I've been that woman before. In other places. The story runs ahead of the person, and the person spends years catching up to it." She picked up the knife again. "What changed things wasn't me doing something extraordinary. It was the fire making it impossible to look at the ordinary things I'd already been doing." Bess was quiet for a moment. "The saddlebag," she said. "The saddlebag was just a bag," Nora said. "It was good work, but it was a bag. What it carried was what mattered, and what it carried was preparation that Caleb had done himself." She paused. People needed something to point to. That was the thing they could point to. "You're not bothered by that?" Nora considered the question honestly. "I'd rather people understood the whole of it," she said. But people need a simple version first. The simple version gets them through the door. The rest of it they learn over time, if they're paying attention. Bess took this in. Then she said, "Caleb's paying attention." "I know he is," Nora said. "Are you going to marry him?" Nora looked up at that. Bess was watching her with the expression of a woman who had decided that directness was worth the risk. Nora held her gaze for a moment. Then she said, "I think that's his question to ask." "Has he asked it?" "Not yet," Nora said. Bess picked up her coffee cup. "He will," she said, with the certainty of someone who had been paying her own kind of attention. "Sa," he asked in January, not in front of anyone, not with ceremony or staging. They were at the Double Horn on a Thursday evening, after supper, sitting at the kitchen table with the remains of Samuel's meal between them, and Pete already gone home to Ida and Samuel in the other room, doing something with considerable clanging that was almost certainly not as necessary as it sounded. The fire in the kitchen stove was the only warm thing in a January that had come in hard, and outside the window the valley was dark and snow-covered and very still. Caleb had been quieter than usual through supper, not unhappy, just inward, the way he got when something was working itself out in him. She'd learned not to pull at these silences. They resolved on their own in his own time, and what came out the other side was always honest. He looked at his hands on the table, then he looked at her. "I've been thinking about asking you something," he said. She waited. "I'm not a man who's good at this kind of thing," he said. "I want you to know that before. I was better at it when I was younger, before I understood how much it mattered." He paused. "When things matter, I get slower." "I know that," she said. "That's not a flaw." He looked at her steadily. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to come here, to the Double Horn, and be here. I want—" He stopped and started again. "I want to make something with you, not because of what you did in the fire, or the summer, or any specific thing, because of how you are, consistently, over time." His jaw moved slightly. "I'm not saying this well." "You're saying it fine," she said. "I need you to know it's not a reward," he said. "That's the part I'm trying to say. It's not, you did good things so you get the prize. It's that I know you now. I've been watching you work and think and handle things and push back at me when I'm wrong, and I know you and I want—" He stopped again. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Something moved across his face. Relief, she thought, and something deeper than relief. The particular expression of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and had just set it down. "You didn't let me finish," he said. "You were going to ask me to marry you," she said. I said yes. I had more to say. "You can say it after," she said. The clanging in the other room stopped very abruptly, which told her that Samuel had been listening with precision, and then started again almost immediately with an innocence that was almost convincing. She looked at the wall in that direction and then back at Caleb, and he was watching her with that open, unguarded expression that she'd seen twice before, and that still disarmed her. "After," he said. "After," she agreed. The rebuilding celebration was held in late February, once the Grady house was finished and livable, and Daniel's wife had put curtains in the windows and declared the place a home. Thomas Adler organized it because Thomas Adler organized everything, and he called it a community supper, which was a modest description for an event that involved the entire valley. 2 fiddles, a banjo player from Billings who had been hired for the occasion, and more food than 350 people could comfortably eat. Nora wore a dress she had made herself, which was not something she usually did. There was something uncomfortable about wearing your own work in public, like reading your own letter aloud. But she'd made it in December in the evenings, a dark wool with a plain collar, and it fit the way things fit when the person making them knew the body exactly. Caleb had looked at it when she arrived at the hall and said, "You made that." "I did. It's good work," he said, which was what he always said about good work, and which she had come to understand was the fullest compliment he knew how to give. The hall was warm and loud and full of the particular energy of people who have been through something hard together and have arrived on the other side of it. The Gradys were there, Daniel and his wife standing near the fireplace in the home-having-survived way of people who have lost something and gotten it back, which is different from people who never lost it at all. The Birches were there, Martin with an ease about him that the summer and fall had not allowed. The 20 cattle had made it through the winter, and the insurance from the lost 40 was covering the spring restock. Tom and Ruth Kellerman arrived together, and Tom, improbably, had allowed Ruth to put a ribbon on his hat for the occasion, which Tom Kellerman would never acknowledge, and which everyone pretended not to notice. Pete Walsh was dancing with Ida in a way that suggested he was significantly better at dancing than he'd ever admitted. And Ida was laughing in the way of a woman who has known something good for long enough that it no longer surprises her, but still pleases her every time. Bess McAllister found Nora early and stayed near her for most of the first hour, which was its own kind of declaration. Bess was not a woman who stood near people accidentally. Margaret Hollis was there. She was talking to Dorothy Crane near the far wall, and she had dressed well, as she always dressed well, and she had the quality of a woman who has recalibrated her understanding of a situation and is managing the recalibration with whatever dignity the situation allows. She caught Nora's eye once, across the room, and something passed between them. Not forgiveness exactly, not warmth, but an acknowledgement, the kind that two people exchange when they have been on opposite sides of something that is now over. And neither of them was entirely right, and neither was entirely wrong. And the only honest thing is to accept the full complexity of that and stop trying to simplify it into a cleaner story. Nora held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, once. Margaret nodded back. It was not a friendship, it might never be. But it was a recognizing, and in Red Hollow Valley, among people who had to share a geography and a water table in a fire season, recognizing was worth something real. Thomas Adler called for quiet at 8 o'clock, rapping the table with his piece of wood, and said a few things about the fire and the rebuild and the community fund and the people who had given their labor and their resources, and he said it all in the blunt, factual way he said everything, without sentimentality, which made it land harder than sentimentality would have. Then Caleb stood up. He didn't call for quiet. Thomas Adler's quiet was still holding, and when Caleb stood, the room stayed with him because the room had learned over the last several months that when Caleb Mercer had something to say, it was worth hearing. He stood near the front of the hall, not on any kind of platform, just on the floor among everyone else, and he looked out at the assembled valley. "I've been part of this valley for 11 years, he said. "I've seen it at its worst. The winter of 79, the drought in 81, when we lost Clara and 15 other people in 2 months. He paused on Clara's name without flinching, the way a man does when grief has aged into something he can carry without hiding. I know what this place costs. I know what it asks of people. He looked around the room, this summer and fall, the water project, the fire, the rebuild. I watched this valley do something I'm not sure I've seen it do before. Not because everything went right, because people chose to work with each other when it would have been easier not to." His eyes found Nora in the crowd. "Some of those people were here before the rest of us knew what we were looking at." The room had the quality of very focused listening. "I'm not going to give a speech about the fire," he said. "Enough has been said about the fire. What I want to do is ask a question." He moved through the crowd toward Nora, not dramatically, just walking, the way he walked everywhere, deliberate and unhurried, and the crowd parted for him in the unconscious way of people who have registered that something is happening. He stopped in front of her. She looked at him. He looked at her. They'd already had this conversation in the warm kitchen in January with Samuel clanging on the other side of the wall. But that had been private and this was not, and the difference was deliberate. She understood that. He was not staging a moment. He was making a statement to the valley that he felt the valley needed to hear. Not as a performance, but as a fact he wanted witnessed. He reached into the pocket of his jacket and produced a ring, small and plain, silver, which she had not seen before, and he held it in his palm. "Nora Whitfield," he said, and his voice was the same voice he used for everything. No added weight, no borrowed drama. Just Caleb, direct and without decoration. "Will you marry me?" He said it without the rising inflection of a question, she noticed. Like he already knew the answer and was making an announcement rather than an inquiry. She found this so entirely characteristic of him that she almost smiled before she answered. "Yes," she said. The same word she'd said in January. Still the right one. Someone in the crowd started it. She never knew who, and then the hall was loud in the specific way of people who have been waiting for a release and found one. Not the polished applause of a performance, but the rough, overlapping sound of people who meant it, who had been through a season of difficulty together, and had arrived at something that felt like earned joy rather than borrowed sentiment. Pete Walsh let out a sound that was undignified and completely joyful, and that she suspected Ida would mention for years. Tom Kellerman did not clap. He stood with his arms crossed and watched with the expression of a man who has assessed a situation and found it satisfactory, which from Tom Kellerman was a standing ovation. Caleb put the ring on her finger. It was slightly too large, and he noticed immediately and said, in a low voice that only she could hear over the noise, "I'll have it sized." "I'll size it myself," she said. "Of course you will," he said. And there was something in his voice that was not the almost smile she was used to, but the real thing, unhurried and unguarded, just his face doing what it wanted to do. She looked down at the ring on her hand, plain and silver and slightly too large, already hers. She looked up and found Margaret Hollis in the crowd, not because she was looking for her, but because Margaret was looking at her. A long, steady look from across the room. Margaret's face did not rearrange itself into something gracious. She was not a woman who performed graciousness she didn't feel. But she was looking at Nora with an expression that had moved past calculation into something more unwilling and more honest. The expression of a woman who has had to revise an important thing she believed about how the world worked, and has done it, and is living in the uncomfortable space of having done it. Nora did not feel victorious. She thought about this later, turning it over carefully the way she turned over pieces of work she was trying to understand. She'd imagined, vaguely, in the months when things had been hardest, that arriving somewhere good would feel like a settling of accounts. It didn't. It felt like the end of a long walk. Tired, present, aware of every step it had taken to get here, not triumphant so much as arrived. The accounts were not what mattered. What mattered was the work she'd done and the work still ahead, the Double Horns West pasture that needed replanting, the water diversion that needed maintenance before spring, the commissions waiting on her table, the ring on her finger that she would resize herself because she always did her own work. She had not come to Red Hollow Valley to prove anything. She had come to work, and she had worked, and the working had been its own argument, slow and quiet, and finally undeniable. The fiddles started up, and the floor cleared for dancing, and Samuel appeared from somewhere, having evidently driven the wagon over from the Double Horn because nothing was going to stop Samuel from being present at a thing this significant. And he stood near the wall with a cup of something warm and watched the room with an expression of thorough satisfaction that he would deny if anyone mentioned it. Bess McAllister danced with her brother. The Gradys danced together, Daniel's wife laughing at something he said. Martin Birch attempted to dance and was firmly corrected by Vera. Tom Kellerman did not dance, but Ruth danced with Pete when Ida needed to sit down. And Tom watched her the way men watched the people they loved when they thought no one was paying attention. Caleb was not a natural dancer. He was too careful about it, too aware of the mechanics, and he told her this before they moved toward the floor. "I'm going to step on you," he said. "I'll move my feet," she said. He stepped on her once, in the first 20 seconds, and said sorry, with a sincerity that was more endearing than competence would have been. And she said it was fine, and they found a rhythm that was not the fiddle's rhythm but their own, which was close enough. She thought about the 6 weeks she'd spent on the saddlebag, the 3 prototypes before the 4th was right, the compass rose she'd tooled along the flap because a person might find it useful to look at when they were tired and far from home. She thought about walking into Margaret Hollis's parlor uninvited and the laughter that came from behind a man who didn't laugh. She thought about a ridge in June, the valley gold below them, hard and beautiful, and not yet decided what it thought of her. The valley had decided, or rather, and this was the part that mattered, the part she turned over until she was sure she had it right. The valley had been given enough information to decide accurately. That was all she had done in the end. Not won anyone over. Not performed herself into acceptability. Just kept working, kept being the same person in the same way, until the evidence accumulated past the point that a different story could be maintained. It was not a dramatic strategy. It was not even really a strategy. It was just the only way she knew how to be. The fiddles played and the fire burned, and outside the hall, the valley lay under its winter dark, the burned sections and the rebuilt sections, and the creek channels that had been rerouted and the fence lines that had been restored, and all the ordinary evidence of a community that had been tested and had not entirely failed. Not a perfect place. Red Hollow Valley had never been a perfect place, and she had not come here looking for one. She had come here with a trunk of tools and a letter of introduction and a practical understanding of what things cost to make. She was still here. She was more here now than she had ever been. Caleb said something into her hair and she pulled back slightly to hear it. He said it again. Pete's crying. She looked over. Pete Walsh was standing at the edge of the floor with his arms crossed and his face doing something he was not successfully managing. And Ida's hand was on his arm and she was saying something to him with the expression of a woman who loved a man's embarrassing sincerity and was never going to let him forget it. Nora looked back at Caleb. He was watching her with the full quality of his attention, the same attention he'd given the latch on the bag in Margaret Hollis's parlor. Not wondering what she was, but knowing, and finding the knowing good. She would resize the ring herself. She would wake up on the double horn in the mornings and see the whole valley from the south window, the one Clara had been fond of, and she would carry that knowledge without grief and without guilt, because a place does not belong to one person's story, and a window is just a window until someone chooses to stand at it. She would fight with Caleb about practical things, and be wrong sometimes and right sometimes, and know the difference imperfectly, the way everyone did. She would keep the workroom. That was not negotiable, and he had not negotiated it. She would train an apprentice eventually, she thought. Some girl who arrived in the valley with nothing but tools and was not sure if there was room for her. There was always room. You made it. The music played on. She stayed in it.